The Great Orion Nebula is a gorgeous sight, hanging the way it does in Orion's sword, and one of the few nebula that's easily bright enough from Earth to be seen even with the naked eye. But it is a challenging target to shoot, isn't it? For those of you who have tried, you're well aware that it is so bright in its core due to the light of several hot stars in the Trapezium cluster and several other massive stars just across the Orion bar in the Theta 2 Orionis cluster, that exposing for Orion creates problems. If one exposes for the bright center stars, then the outer gases of the nebula will be much too dark and not show up well. But if one exposes for the nebulosity and the outer parts of the nebula, then the very bright stars at the middle will also not show up well. In fact, there is such a variation between the brightest brights and the darkest darks around the Great Orion Nebula region that even trying to expose for the mid-range isn't going to be satisfactory. You'll get perhaps good detail on the mid-range, but you'll still overexpose the brights and underexpose the darks. The only way to resolve this issue is to make multiple sets of exposures, exposing for the brightest regions, mid-regions, and darkest regions. Then each of those sets of exposures have to be stacked separately, and then one of the more typical development protocols is to then merge all of those developed masters together. If you're using PixInsight, you would use a process like HDR composition for that. The problem is, I've never found HDR composition to really give satisfactory results, not all by itself. It's not a bad tool, and I have no doubt that there are plenty of persons out there who have mastered it in such a way to get some extraordinary results. But all by itself, I find it wanting, sometimes anyway. If I was using a dimmer high dynamic range target, yeah sure, I'd probably use it. But with something with an extreme difference between the brightest brights and the darkest darks, like the Great Orion Nebula, I prefer a different way. And today, we're going to study that way. And if you go about that different way, you can get results like this. This is a high dynamic range image of the Great Orion Nebula that I created from 16.33 minutes worth of data. You're probably thinking that's not much time on a target, and normally that would be true. But the Great Orion Nebula is just so bright that we don't need much exposure. This information was captured using a Williams Optics 81mm apo-refractor and a Player 1 Uranus-C camera, which uses the 585MC sensor, the same sensor found in the very similar camera by ZWO, the ZWO ASI 585MC. The three groups of exposures were 101 second exposures, gain 250, offset 10, and 105 second exposures, same settings, and 1920 second exposures, same settings. You're probably wondering why I didn't go with an even 20. Well, I had intended to, just for whatever reason, one of the images was corrupted. All right, let's dive into how this is done. I've already stacked the data sets and run spectrophotometric color calibration on each of them. Now, since we have three different data sets, we need to make sure they are all properly aligned. These images were all shot at the same time, the camera was at the same angle, so that's not the issue. But there can be a little bit of natural drift in the course of shooting images, and the mount does dither every few images, so the image portrayed in each master plate might be just out of sync with the other two. Fortunately, PixInsight gives us an easy way to line them all up. PixInsight is smart enough to know that if you're stacking images over one another, you probably want them to align, and it will snap them into place. Alright, let's take a moment and just let PixInsight help us align these separate masters. So all we're going to do is drag each of our three images over one another, lining them up more or less equally, and when the stars are in alignment, PixInsight will snap the images perfectly over one another. Just release the image plates when they snap. Now, we're going to run a dynamic crop on the image plate so that they are all cropped in the exact same way. This will be necessary because later on we're going to move to a different editor to finish up to the creation of this HDR image. And by making sure that all the images are aligned evenly and cropped in the same way, we can easily snap the images over one another in the different photo editor. Now that the images are aligned, I'm just going to shrink two of them and get them out of the way. With the dynamic crop tool open, we'll go ahead and draw a crop that's going to contain information found in all three images. And then we're going to execute that crop process on the two minimized images. And you can do this by dragging that triangular crop icon over onto the desktop, and then dragging the process icon over the minimized images. Or you could simply drag the process itself, the triangle, over those minimized images. For the image that you actually drew the crop on though, dragging a process icon over it won't work. The dynamic crop tool is using that image as its reference point, so to speak, and it needs you to actually execute the dynamic crop on that image. So just go ahead and hit the check mark when you're done with the other two images to execute the dynamic crop on that image. With that done, all the images are aligned and cropped in the same way. So when we have to move over to the next editor, they will be ready to easily stack over one another and work with. You'll see why that's important when we get into this section with the next editor. Now on each master, we're going to run Blur Exterminator at default settings but using AI4, and then Star Exterminator with the Generate Star Image option selected and using the full version of its AI2. We are going to make and keep a separate star image from each of the 1 second, 5 second, and 20 second masters. In the final editing, we'll need the 1 second star plate and the 20 second star plate. I'm not sure about the 5 second one, but we'll keep it anyway for now. When we're done, we'll have 3 masters of the Great Orion Nebulous region with their stars removed. But we don't want that. In the Aesthetic Development Protocol, I found that you get much better images when Blur Exterminator is run last after Noise Exterminator. And I know, as always, that is literally going to fly in the face of some people doing astrophotography. In the 4 videos that I've put out on this method, I demonstrate the outcomes each time. The images are richer and sharper, and the color fidelity is better. And by using the advanced ADP method here, we're very early on, right after running spectrophotometric color calibration. We ran Blur Exterminator to properly deconvolve the stars and then remove them. We were able to end up with star plates that we can use later that have true deconvolution. Nice, tight, beautiful stars that astrophotographers often want. So anyway, on each of these masters, we are then going to undo all of those transformations we just did. We are simply going to hit the backup button and undo Star Exterminator, and hit it again and undo Blur Exterminator on each of the masters. And you might be thinking, hey, that's a little nuts. You just undid a lot of work. Well, we get to keep the star plates doing this, but yeah, we're undoing a lot of work. But the way to get the most beautiful images, at least the most beautiful portrayals of nebulosity and other structures, is to run Noise Exterminator and Blur Exterminator at the very end of the development procedure. So we need to go back to the point before Blur Exterminator was run. We're going to run histogram transformation on all 6 of the images we now have, our 3 masters of the nebula and our 3 star plates. While we're not going to use the exact same curve for each of the images, we are going to apply the same theory. Now, I find the histogram transformation tool to be the single easiest and most powerful tool to do this. It puts everything in manual control, and it only takes a few seconds to do it. You really don't need a script to do this right. You really shouldn't be trying to edit photos and get brightness and darkness and everything just right when you're doing histograms anyway. That's a job for the curves tool. If you want to learn more about that, check out this link here on mastering histogram transformation. When the histogram is done on each master of the nebula, I'm then going to open up the curves tool and adjust the curves. This next part is very important. The 1 second master was specifically exposed to capture the extreme brightness at the core of the nebula. And you can see, even at 1 second, that core is very bright. Now always start working curves on the luminance channel. And what we're going to do here is drag the luminance channel way down, exposing for those stars in the Trapezium and Theta 2 Orionis clusters. Our goal here, above everything else, is to keep that inner core nice and resolved. And it is so bright that it is almost impossible to adjust the exposure for that inner region and maintain any detail even in the middle regions of the nebula. But that's okay. All we're aiming to do here is not blow out the core, while preserving as much detail there as possible. When I have the curves where I want them, I'll run the process on the 1 second image, and then complete the editing of this image by running Noise Exterminator first, then Blur Exterminator using AI4, and then finally Star Exterminator to get rid of the stars once again. When that's all done, the 1 second master is going to be completed, and it's going to yield us another star plate. But this star plate will not be properly deconvolved. I'm always reluctant to throw away plates until I'm done with the project, so I'm not going to delete them just now. Instead, I'm just going to label them Junk Stars 1 second and set them aside, though we aren't going to use them for the rest of this project. I will, however, save the master 1 second as a TIFF for use in the other editor, and just for security, I'm also going to save it as an XISF, in case for some reason I might want to come back and work on it later on. One very important thing to bear in mind is, if removing stars anytime after your histogram has been stretched, be sure to select the unscreen option on the Star Exterminator so it knows that. It'll do a better job removing the stars. Now that the master 1-second plate is properly edited, I'll go back to the deconvolved stars from the 1-second master plate that I extracted at the beginning of this procedure and run a histogram transformation on them too. My goal is going to be to bring up the brightness enough that they are readily visible and clearly distinct, and I'll add just a touch of saturation to the star plate to help bring out the star's color. And again, if you're curious about how I do this, I eyeball the luminosity of the stars, but applying the methodology from the theory that I went over in the video on mastering histograms. So while the curves may vary from image plate to image plate, the theory that's applied is the same. That's our consistent variable here. A person mentioned to me not long ago that he was concerned about not staying true to the original images. Bear in mind, it's typically impossible to keep stars true to their luminosity when we're filming them with things like galaxies or nebulous structures in the background, because the stars are so much brighter. We can't raise their brightness in conjunction with those other structures. Otherwise, we'll simply blow the stars out. Also, don't be overly reliant on the automation of applications to give you a good balance of luminosity or color or anything. Photographic technology doesn't work like that. The sensors that catch the images have their specifications, which are designed by the people that create them, and the applications themselves have their algorithms by which they process the information, again trying to keep to the visions of the persons that make them. And yes, they're trying to keep it as realistic as possible in most cases, but ultimately the software itself processes according to the creator's vision, which is why I always tell people, don't be afraid to exercise your vision. It's your image. Make it beautiful in your way. So with the 1-second master and its star plate done, we're going to move on to the 5-second master and its star plate. And here we are going to more or less execute the same strategy, but our goal here is going to be to maximize the detail and the appearance of the mid-level tones of this nebula, which is primarily that colored region just outside of the core around the trapezium cluster and the Theta 2 Orionis region. Just as before, we're going to stretch the histograms using the strategy that I covered in that previous video on mastering histograms in such a way to give us a good black point, but keep all of the information on the right side of the light curve. And above all, bear in mind when working with the histogram transformation, we aren't really aiming to do any editing. We simply want to enhance the light curve and be sure to keep all the relevant information. Once that's done, we're going to move over to the curves transformation tool. And then as always, we are going to begin by resetting the tool to make sure it's fresh, switch to the luminosity channel, and adjust the luminance of the image. This time, we are focusing on maximizing the detail and overall quality of the mid-range tones. That's primarily those pinkish red tones in the mid-range of the nebula. It takes multiple attempts to get the curve just right, where we capture mid-level luminosity without too steep a transition. When it's done, we'll finish by running the noise exterminator at default settings, then blur exterminator using AI4, and then finally star exterminator, though we are just going to label the star plate that it produces as junk stars and set them aside. And then, just as before, we'll go ahead and adjust the histogram and the saturation curve just a little on the 5-second star plate. Since that part of the procedure is pretty much just like I did the 1-second master and 1-second star plate, I'll skip over the remainder of that, so this video doesn't become overly long. It's already pretty long. Now we're up to the 20-second exposure. In this exposure, we are going to develop to maximize the cloud structure in the dim outer regions of the nebula, and also the dimmer cloud structure to be found around the Running Man and between the Running Man Nebula and the Orion Nebula. Now, we're going to work the histogram according to the exact same strategy. We never do our editing in the histogram. That's a misuse of a histogram. We're going to apply that histogram transformation theory that I brought up in the Mastering Histograms video to set the black points at the beginning of the relevant data on the left side of the light curve and the middle icon at the beginning of the right side of the light curve. And in this way, create a flat master 20-second image that contains all the information ready to work with the curves transformation tool. You might notice I'm not jumping to a lot of other tools in PixInsight. They're there, and now and then I use them, but by and large, they're unnecessary. If you really master the usage of histogram transformation and curves transformation, the other tools, they're more like baubles. I might touch them now and then, but overall, they're just not needed all that much. So we'll go ahead and action the histogram process, and then open up the curves transformation tool. As always, we'll start in the luminance channel, and we're going to curve up to really aim to bring out the cloud structure in those dimmer regions, which means we're going to be dragging up from the left side of the histogram tool. We'll drag the right side down just a little just to minimize a little bit of that light from the core wandering into the outer regions and slightly unbalancing it. And we'll increase the saturation a little just to enrich the color in the outer darker regions. However, you might notice something different here. There are no stars in the image. Unlike the 1 second and the 5 second masters, I took the stars out of this plate as soon as I started working with it. The reason I did that is, this is 20 seconds of exposure. These stars are going to be pretty bright. The Great Orion Nebula region is a bright region, and I knew if I started stretching the histogram and then working with the curves with the stars still in there, they would really flare. So as before, I set the star exterminator to the unscreen option and took the stars out, except this time I took the stars out first thing. Now I found the curve I'm looking for. The outer cloud structures are emphasized quite well, while the extreme brightness of the core of the Orion is mitigated. I'm going to action that curve, then run noise exterminator, then blur exterminator to maximize the resolution and beauty of this image. And then we're going to jump over into the next image editor, Affinity Photo. Now Affinity Photo is very similar to Photoshop. In fact, if you know how to use Photoshop, you'll probably adjust to Affinity Photo very easily. They're both layers based and the layouts are very similar. They're virtually copycats of one another and always have been. I'm not entirely sure about this, but I think Affinity Photo was something that Apple used to include with all their computers for a long time. And in the old days of computing, photo editing software was very expensive, so it was one of the benefits of buying Apples and why they used to say if you want to work with imagery, get an Apple. But anyway, I've tried many times to maximize the high dynamic range, beauty, and accuracy of this nebula within PixInsight, and it does a good job, but it doesn't do the best job. Now, somebody more expert at the execution of PixInsight's more esoteric functions might be able to handle this better than me, but I know Affinity Photo. I've used it for many years, and I do believe it is the better editor for what I'm about to do. So with Affinity Photo open, I'm going to start by dragging the master 1 second image into the photo editor. Now this image is pretty much ready to go as it is. We have a nicely detailed core, including the division between the Orion bar, which is that division between the white area and the pinkish area on the lower side of the central region of the nebula. The central region is an important point of interest within the Orion Nebula, and a big part of its beauty, but it's also where the challenge is. It is just so bright. To deal with it, we are then going to drag over our 5 second master. I have the Snap Align tool turned on in Affinity Photo, and we're just going to drag that 5 second master directly over the 1 second master, and now they are perfectly aligned. Now the 5 second master gives us good middle brightness range. So what I'm going to do is just open up the Erase tool, set the hardness to somewhere between 0 and 1%, and the flow to somewhere between 0 and about 15%, depending on which portion of this operation I'm going to do. And I'm just going to erase out the core from the 5 second master. This reveals the detailed core that we have in the 1 second master, where we exposed for the core. This too is an iterative process because the trick is, we have to find the right flow and hardness percentages and the right brush size to erase out the 5 second layer in such a way that it reveals the 1 second layer without looking choppy. It's a little tricky because the residual saturation in the 5 second layer tends to mess with the saturation in the lower layer, but we'll deal with that later on. You'll see how we end up dealing with this. When this part of the process is done, we're going to drag in the 20 second master. The snap tool is on, so it's easy to align perfectly over the previous 2 plates. And with the 20 second exposure, what we're going to do is go back to our erase brush and erase out the sections of middle to bright luminosity. That's the core and the midsections of the Orion. Now let's restore a bit of the color in the image. Affinity Photo gives us a lot of ways to go about doing this. Mostly, what I want to restore is those reddish hues in the midtones of the nebula. And in Affinity Photo, one of the best ways to do this is with the Saturation and Vibrance tool. We place the Saturation and Vibrance tool inside of the 5 second layer, so it only affects the 5 second layer. And now we'll go ahead and bring our stars back into the image. All in all, we're going to need 2 of the star layers, the 1 second and the 20 second. To make those star layers visible, I'm going to use Affinity Photo's extremely powerful compositing options and select the screen compositing option so that the stars become visible over the nebula. We'll use the 1 second stars with the 1 second image because they are the least bright, occupy the fewest pixels, and so are the most defined. And the stars of the trapezium cluster in particular are very close set. So we can't let them get too bright, otherwise they'll flare and we'll lose sight of the individual core stars. Those stars are a little dim, so we're going to add a brightness tool to the 1 second star layer so that the brightness tool only affects the stars of the 1 second star layer. We're going to crank these stars up enough that they are more visible, but avoid letting them flare so much that the individual stars of the trapezium cluster at the core of the nebula become lost in each other. Then we're going to drag in the stars of the 22nd plate, and we're going to use this plate for all of the stars outside of the core of the nebula. With the 22nd star plate layer selected, we'll go to the compositor and again select the screen option so that the stars show over the nebula. There are a lot of dim stars in this nebula, at least dim compared to the Orion itself, especially around the core, and we want to be able to incorporate those stars into the image. So we'll put the 22nd star plate at the very top of the layers so that it shows over everything else, and then erase out the 22nd stars from the core where they're overly bright. That way in the core, we retain the more resolved stars from the 1 second plate. They're tighter with less flaring. Now, I feel that there is a bit of an unnatural transition in brightness between the core and the rest of the nebula. I know we have to bring down the brightness of that region an awful lot, but the transition should be smoother so that it blends in better. We also need to bring in some of that washed out color, the color that was washed out by merging the two layers over each other. Sometimes it happens, sometimes the layers can interact in odd ways, especially with things like saturation. We're going to deal with some of that artificial brightness transition, first by adding a brightness contrast tool to the 1 second master layer. And we're just going to bring up the brightness just a little bit to about 25 to 30%, which gives an appearance of a smoother transition between the bright region and the darker regions in the mid-range of the nebula. Then we're also going to put a vibrance saturation tool in the 1 second master and crank up the saturation just a little bit to also help restore some of that color that was lost. When that's looking good, we're going to open up an HSL tool also within the 1 second master, and we're going to use it to shift the saturation introduced by the vibrance saturation tool just a little, so that the hue matches the color of the rest of the middle region of the nebula. Now, on many occasions I've said one should be using a second editor for handling astro images, a tool like Photoshop or Affinity Photo, due to their powerful compositing options. And now you're going to see why. See, I feel this image looks good now, but there's not enough contrast in the dark regions. The space needs to be darker. And I want to bring up the sharpness just a little bit, and Affinity Photo in particular has superb AI. It does wonderful things with sharpening, as long as you use it in moderation, but everything's like that, eh? You gotta use things in moderation. So now I'm going to open up a sharpening tool and put it at the very top of the layer so that it affects everything. I set the sharpness tool itself for 12%, which appears to give a little bit of dimensionality and resolve a bit of detail nicely within the nebula. The goal is just to resolve, just to improve what's there, not add anything new. And clarity is just a refined way of working with contrast adjustments. It just makes very small contrast adjustments, or rather, I should say, it adjusts contrast on fine detail to bring out an appearance of resolution. You can overdo clarity easily and then you get blocky, chunky, pixelated looking images, even posterized. But a little bit of clarity here helps. But in this final step, this is where the magic happens. If you look on the upper side of the middle far right, you'll see that composition tool. Right now the composition tool is at normal. And I want to enhance the contrast in this image. I want to lower the darks without really affecting what we already have. I can composite the sharpening tool into the image in such a way that does just that. Instead of having the sharpening tool simply overlay the entire image with a sharpening screen or filter, I can use the compositing tool to tell the sharpening tool to overlay the image as if it were applying a soft light to the image, illuminating the substance and passing through the areas of darkness, thereby very naturally enhancing both. And now we end up with the finished image. A full high dynamic range image of the very difficult to shoot Great Orion Nebula and its companion nebulae, a target that is notoriously difficult to manage because of the extreme brightness at the core versus the much dimmer outer regions. And yet, here we have it all resolved, from the dim clouds on the outside to the individual stars of the Trapezium cluster. And this could only have been accomplished by going outside of PixInsight. Don't get me wrong, I'm not knocking PixInsight. It is an absolutely amazing tool. But if you really want to bring the best out of your images, you're going to have to push beyond it. I hope that helps. Thanks for watching, and let me know if you have any questions. Until next time, get out there and shoot the sky.